Hi folks, this is Stoic Steve. Today I'm playing Galactic Junk League, a game which will soon be taken completely offline. This is a free-to-play game that was put out several years ago, but will soon be closing down its servers, so completely dead game very soon. But I personally put about 500 hours into the game, so I figured I'd come in, get some footage before it completely closes down. For all of you who haven't seen it, get a little taste of what it was like. Galactic Junk League was a fun game. It's similar to TerraTech or RoboCraft, and it's a block-based building game. You build spacecraft and fight them all in an arena. For me, this was an alternative to RoboCraft, which personally I stopped playing when they got rid of the MegaCraft, the giant builds. Also before they initiated the loot system, which I know was controversial. The game follows a similar system to other block building games where you have a central core. When it's destroyed, your vehicle is destroyed. The only real requirements in the game were that your vehicle have at least one thruster, at least one gyroscope, and at least one weapon. Besides that, you could build pretty much whatever. You had your standard Starship Enterprise builds, your people building anime characters or swastikas, all that jazz. Personally, I'm all about just optimizing everything. Initially, this game had 5 classes of ships. The 5th one was just a starter craft, so it really didn't have any special abilities to it. But the other 4, you have the Frigate, which was the small, agile craft, had some pretty devastating abilities, but was all in all not too strong without those abilities. The Battleship was your slow, tanky craft. One of the downsides of the Battleship being that it has a range cap, which means it can't get the full benefit from using Gauss cannons. You had the Cruiser, which was your middle ground vehicle, had a good speed, good damage, and a lot of special abilities. All in all, the Cruiser was your most versatile craft. And Destroyer was your sniper class, your long range. Destroyer was a weaker class, high damage. It did get a minus to short range weapons. Pretty well encouraged to use long ranged ones. So every class had something unique to them. The Frigate had a booster that only it could equip. The Battleship had a 2x2 armor plate. Like per block it was worth the same as a regular armor piece. But because it was 4 times the size, it could absorb 4 times damage, which was helpful. And the Destroyer had a long-range cannon that only it could equip. The Destroyer also gets a class-specific gyroscope. It's a little bit more efficient. Furthermore, every class had its own type of shield, which most of the time, most of the classes would rely on that shield. The Frigate had a shield, which would make it completely invulnerable for several seconds. You do not want to engage most enemies without your shield active, because the Frigate is so weak and susceptible to damage. The Battleship, then its shield was defensive mode, which you could activate or deactivate, but it would reduce your speed by half and reduce damage you take pretty significantly. The Cruiser had a permanent shield. The permanent shield was the only type of shield that absorbed a fixed amount of damage which would not be applied to the ship. It would take a few moments to recharge, but if you were careful while using the shield, you could make the Cruiser last for a very long time without ever actually taking damage to the ship itself. The shield on the Destroyer only deployed when you were completely still for 5 seconds. It would reduce your total damage taken. Additionally, the Frigate had a particle burst that disables an enemy's weapons and abilities and movement. Important to note though, it doesn't say in the description, but this would only stun the enemy for as long as you did not deal damage to them. If you started dealing damage to your opponent while they were under the effect of particle burst, the particle burst would end. The Frigate also had weapon overload, basically increases your damage but increases the energy drain of your weapons. So really only useful if you have a lot of energy regeneration on your ship. Then it also had tactical swap. Target an enemy ship, wait 6 seconds, then you'll swap places with that ship. was more of a novelty, really, I guess. Wasn't super useful. The battleship abilities included backup battery, which would just recharge your energy to 100%. Graviton wave, which would slow down enemies. You have damage absorb, which would absorb any oncoming damage and fire back at enemies within a range. Magnetic cannon was especially useful for slower battleships. Instantly pull in enemies. The cruiser had a graviton beam that slowed down enemy ships. It had EMP wave, which would disable all weapons and abilities of an enemy for several seconds. Stasis bubble made the target invulnerable. You could actually target friendlies or enemies with this. They can't move, they can't fire, they can't use abilities. Basically, this was your biggest griefing ability in the game. Also had electron field. Electron field, quite useful. Increases the energy regeneration. Energy regen, that was a large element of your DPS. You had damage leecher. Whenever you deal damage, it increases your total damage output, which is very useful. And you had a support shield. So you could cast a shield on your friendly units, and that would in turn give you a shield buff. As for the destroyer, it had artillery mode, which would increase the range on all the weapons of the craft. You'd have mark target, which would increase the damage the vehicle would deal. Maneuver thrusters, increase your acceleration. Then you have plasma ball, which you could fire at enemies, and you press spacebar within a range of the target and it would explode. Additionally, there were several common abilities that any craft could use. You'd have engine overload. It increased your speed for a time, which is very useful. Tactical jump, which that was your teleport ability. It's very useful. Generator overload, increase your energy regeneration, very important. And you had bang, which was basically a self-destruct. If you could stay close to your enemy when you're self-destructing, you could usually kill them with that. But it tends to be quite difficult to stay that close. Every block that you placed on a vehicle would cost CPU, and any abilities that you place on your vehicle would cost AP. The game would allow you to place a certain number of hull blocks, your basic building blocks, for free. Mostly these were used as a free armor in place of the armor plates, which would cost CPU. You could also place aesthetic add-on items up to a certain number for free. You also had a generator, and you'd have a battery. Generator would increase your energy regeneration, and your battery would increase your total storage. Usually I'd only have maybe 1 to 3 batteries on a vehicle, and I'd have as many generators as I could to sort of sustain fire. There were a total of 7 types of weapons you could use. The phaser was your basic starting weapon. You know, as you'd level up, you'd unlock new weapons and new abilities for each class. You know, very low DPS, short range, low energy consumption, but it only took up 1 block, so if you need something light and fast, it worked well enough. You also had the Gatling Gauss, which was your highest DPS. This one, like the rest of the Gauss weapons, had a bullet travel time, so you had to lead your targets a bit. It was a shorter ranged item, but it was worth it for the extra DPS. All the weapons had the same CPU usage, except for the Uber Cannon. The Uber Cannon was basically just a longer range version of the Gauss Cannon. Had virtually the same DPS, higher damage per shot, solar attack speed. Most importantly, I found, was that it had less turn. Whereas your regular Gauss Cannon could aim up and down and a little bit behind it, the Uber Cannon couldn't quite aim all the way up or down, so had a lot of lost versatility. Now, your missile types were the only ones that didn't have to worry about the turning angle of the gun itself. You could place these anywhere on your vehicle as long as they could fire out. They could lock on to your target. They did have a bit of a travel time. They would always aim at the block that you clicked on when you fired, and they'd try to close the distance that way. Because of their travel time, it was quite possible for an opponent to get behind cover during that time and have the rocket just run into rock or whatever. The regular rocket launcher was a shorter range, good DPS. The cruise missile was a longer ranged version of the rocket launcher. Basically, while it seems more versatile, it has pitifully low DPS, which basically made it unused. One of the benefits, though, of rockets was that you could fire it from behind cover. If you had your rockets all facing the same direction, they'd all come out from behind cover and aim towards your enemy, which is quite useful. My personal favorite was definitely the heavy laser. It's a 2x2 weapon, good range, good DPS. The damage was instantaneous, and it was basically pinpoint damage. It made it very easy to exploit weak points in your opponents. You could make very surgical cuts. The game had a pretty basic matchmaking system. You simply click to join a match, and it would automatically match you up with whoever had an acceptable ping. Early on in the game's life, it was exclusively a team deathmatch. Later on, it switched to team point capture. You could no longer do team deathmatch. If you couldn't find an opponent within a few minutes, the game would automatically set you against AI. You could also do a custom game. There are 4 additional maps which were all for team deathmatch. They had a basic system where you just type in a name for the game, then if you had a friend that wanted to play, they just type in the same game name that it would automatically enter you into the same game. And from there you could add bots if you wanted to. Any human players would always end up being the top slots, display their weapon types and their class types beforehand on the screen. And I would always use this time to figure out where the enemy cockpit was, so I'd know where to focus down or look for weak points in enemy designs before the fight. All of the AI craft are designs that are available in the shop. Later on, the game gave you the ability to like opponent designs. Liking them would increase the amount of XP and money you would get out of each fight. And you'd gain XP and money based on how much damage you dealt and how many capture points and power-ups you collected through a match. If you got a kill, you would gain more XP than if you got an assist and such. For the point capture, you had power-ups that you could collect. There were a damage team power-up, a shield team power-up, and a speed team power-up that you could collect to help your team out. Of course, the shield team power-up was the most useful of the 3, just because the shield would greatly increase the lifespan of most craft, since you cannot heal. I always prioritize getting that whenever I could. Also, unlike the other power-ups, the shield didn't have limited duration. It was permanent once you got it, though it didn't recharge. Any of the yellow arrow power-ups that you collected would either place mines at the capture point, or if you collected 2 of the arrows, that would create a barrier around the capture point. And you could continually recollect those. Any overlaying power-ups would be sent to another control point that your team controlled, or it would renew the mines if they got blown up. And as the match would go on, if your team began to lose, teleporters would open up that would take you from your spawn point to different locations. It either would teleport you to the center of the map or to one of the capture points, making it easier to get those back. A couple of the maps did have teleporters that were permanently active. There's one at either end of the map, so if you wanted to, you could go into the teleporter and wind up at your opponent's side of the map. It was a little bit too far out of the way to be useful, but it was an amusing thing that you could do if you desperately wanted to get behind enemy lines. Of course, all the maps had invisible boundaries, both at the top of the map and around the corners. While there are also some unusual boundaries around the rocks. A few of the maps did have spots where you could actually fly through the ground. You can't really fly back through most of the ground if you did this. You could sometimes fire up at enemies through the ground. The AI tended to follow a sort of rock, paper, scissors sort of format. Now while the AI would normally attack you back if you attacked it, if the AI was a destroyer, it would always focus down a battleship. If it was a battleship, it would focus down cruisers. And if it was a cruiser, it would focus down a frigate. And a frigate would focus down destroyers. This generally made it hardest to play as a destroyer, simply because the frigates were always the fastest. Every time you were destroyed, your cooldown timers on all of your abilities would reset. And so for the destroyer, you'd always have frigates coming in high speed, and they'd always have their invulnerability shield ready to go. I often wish there was a damage cap on the shield for frigates, rather than plain invincibility. That way you could chew through them if you needed to, if you had enough DPS. Well, it can be a bit more challenging. It is quite fun when you get a good build. And down here you could see all the stats for your vehicle. Display your damage, your HP, your NHG production versus consumption. General rule, you would want your energy consumption to be high enough to at least kill one enemy before it ran out. That way if you needed to, you could recharge between fights. Your speed, if you're any slower than 150 meters per second, you absolutely have to have movement abilities. Your movement abilities being your overdrive and your teleport. As far as the HP goes, I usually try to minimize the number of non-essential blocks that I could, use as little armor as I needed to. My oldest design here is the battleship. You'll see most of my designs are essentially a gun wall with boosters and all the softer stuff behind it. Because with the exception of missiles, you could only get your highest DPS on an enemy if all of your weapons could aim at that enemy at the same time. It was always a fun thing to have your vehicle fall apart. Kind of felt like the damage you took mattered more. There's no way to repair once you took damage. You'd always have to work around the lost parts as you fight. And some people could build their ships so that as they take damage, they might become faster, as they just have boosters and gyroscopes connecting to their main craft. So even if you couldn't deal damage, you could still run around and collect the control points quite effectively. And if you ever needed to self-destruct, you could just press K. And when you're ever heavily damaged, you're always trying to decide, is it worth staying alive or just self-destruct to get your full strength back? And whether an enemy shows up on your radar is dependent upon whether you or a friendly player has a line of sight on them. It was helpful to have someone scout out and determine where an opponent was. This Gatling Gauss cruiser was overall my favorite of the draft. Highest DPS of all of them, because Gatling guns. With the damage leecher ability for the cruiser, it would drastically increase its total DPS. Of course, block-wise, it's quite minimal. It has a couple spare hull blocks on the side just for a little bit of extra armor. Besides that, it's just guns, generators, and boosters, as well as the abilities. You'll see the abilities are all numbered. That's what button you press on your keyboard to activate them. What order they're in is always which order they're placed down in. So if you want to change what button you have to press for one ability, usually you have to replace the rest of the ability items, which can get a little bit annoying at times, but you know. Once the damage leeches all the way up, it pretty much just takes an instant to kill any enemy with this thing. It was very effective, so long as you could track an enemy properly. And of course, while this is very high DPS, once it does lose its shield, it does fall apart quite quickly. Always keep on top of your cooldowns. Always have a friendly unit you can apply a shield to, thus increasing your own shield. The Cruiser was the only class that had abilities that were granted XP, because it was the only class that really had abilities that would affect friendlies. And this T-shaped Cruiser, I built more for fun than anything. Not something I would normally use, and it's something I would hate to be up against. With the exception of this build right here, all of my ships were DPS oriented. It's purely about capturing points and harassing opponents. It only has the one phaser on front, so it can't deal hardly any damage. But between the graviton beams slowing down enemies, with the stasis bubble completely freezing enemies for 10 seconds, it was super annoying to fight. And with it moving around constantly with the shield on, it's very difficult to deal meaningful damage to it. There is nothing more annoying than being stuck in a bubble, just constantly getting bubble locked, not being able to move, not being able to fight, having no way of getting out. Yeah, basically floating around, giving my teammates shields, slowing down or freezing enemies, capturing points, and capturing all the power-ups, just being annoying. And of course, if you did a more harassment-based rather than damage-based, you'd usually end up around 25k score, which was alright. You can definitely get a much higher score if you go for high damage. You can usually get to 4,000, 5,000, sometimes up to 6,000 range. And at the end of the match, it would give you additional points for having the highest score or having the most kills or least deaths. It would add to your total XP or money at the end. And of course, the game had a daily quest system. It was basically just play X number of games with a particular type of weapon or particular type of craft. It gave a bit of incentive to play with the different weapon types and class types, so you didn't always do the same thing. The game also had a little personal stat page. Showed you how many games you played, wins, losses, kills, preferred weapon, your preferred class, and all that. Also had a little Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame was sadly quite basic. The only thing it cared about was your total wins. So, you know, you could have like a perfect KD, a perfect win-loss ratio, but if another guy, even though he lost like 5 times as many games, he'd still be in first place just because he had the most wins. It just made the Hall of Fame not really worth going for, because you always have that one lifeless player who would just play the game non-stop. And the game would give you the option to change the color of items or change the skin for an item. It had versions you could buy in the shop. And while you could purchase premium, which would increase your XP gain and money gain while you play, everything else that you could purchase with real money was an aesthetic item. Most of the aesthetic items were pretty fitting to the theme, had sort of a junkish feel. My only real gripe is that a few of them are a bit too clean. Like, when I think Galactic Junk League, I think just tossed together, like, rusted items. Very expendable ships. And personally, I just use the aesthetic items to sort of obscure anything that an opponent might like to snipe. They might fire at the fence and just not hit anything critical at all. All in all, Galactic Junk League was a fun game. Wasn't perfect in a lot of ways. I definitely feel like it had a lot more potential that it just never reached. It could definitely be a grind at times. It also would have improve the game in general if you had multiple game types in circulation. Switch between capture point and deathmatch. Maybe get like a King of the Hill. Get some free-for-all games. I think that would have been fun for people. Had a lot of just fun rivalries when I played and people to watch out for. A lot of good times. Had a number of things I was looking for in a game. The ability to build custom craft that you fight with. It's always something that appeals to me. Bit sad to see the game go. Always kind of hoped I'd get one of my friends to play it with me, but no such luck. And of course, if you really want to, the game will be up for about 40 more days before the servers go offline. Give it a little try out if you want. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed. If you have any similar games, I know there are a few other along these lines out there that you've played, thought were pretty fun. Maybe they're dead games now, but they were good while they lasted. Just put them in the comments, take a look, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.